Pneumatic tyres are awesome. They offer traction, they offer control, they offer an efficiency that not many vehicles can offer. I mean, assuming you set the right pressure. You did set the right pressure, didn't you? We're going to try and explain all the factors to help you set the perfect pressure. While tyres aren't new, there's a lot going on with a humble tyre, and it should be, if you're doing it right, the only contact patch. So setting pressure is important, whether you're on a rigid XC bike or a full travel park bike. Why? Because it's your first suspension system. Setting pressures is an engaging process, but getting it wrong could lead to a flat. Getting it wrong could lead to a damaged tyre or a damaged rim. Getting it wrong could lead to a crash. But that perfect pressure, you've got traction, you've got control, you've got damping, you've got rolling efficiency. It is sublime. Playing with pressure is one of the best performance upgrades that you can make to your bike wherever you ride. And, well, it's really simple. There's just a few things that you'll need. Now, most people, when they're setting pressures, will just use a track pump the tyre up and then use their hand to check. And, well, pump is an essential because you need to put more air in, but using your hands to check, well, it doesn't really work. You'll need a digital pressure gauge to do it accurately and consistently. You can get really fine detail with a digital pressure gauge, so it is better. There's a technique that you can use with your hands to benchmark if it's too low or too high, but yeah, the gauge is best. So many people do a squeeze test, and it's not that accurate because, well, your tyre carcass will be different and also your hand strength can change. But there is a technique that can work with your hands. First, lay one thumb over the tyre. Next, place your other hand over the top. Then put your weight, pretty much all your weight, onto the tyre. If your thumb isn't compressing into the tyre, so it feels like you're crushing your hand with your own weight, your tyre pressure is too high. If, when your hand is on top, your thumb is almost touching the rim inside, your tyre pressure is too soft. And I know this sounds really mad in terms of setting a benchmark, but it's a good place to start if you've only got your hands. We need to get nerdy about tyres. We need to talk about width, we need to talk about carcass, we need to talk about tubes or tubeless. Width is important because width is linked to volume. Okay, volume and the shape of the tyre can change a little bit down to carcass, but essentially we've just got two fixed points. So as the width increases, so does the volume because, well, we've only got these 2 points to fix it, and it means that the tyre is going to grow in height and in width. Volume matters thanks to Boyle's law, and that states that pressure and volume have an inverse relationship. This means as a volume doubles, the pressure halves. And what this means is that if you've got a wider tyre, you can run it at a lower pressure to get that similar contact patch. If you're running tubeless, then beads matter too. Why? Because you should have a tight interface fit, and that means if you're running really low pressures, you're not going to get any burping. Different tyres will have different construction and different sidewall strengths. Why? Well, price and purpose. It's just that simple. So in an entry-level tyre, you're going to have a relatively basic construction, simple carcass, maybe a harder compound, and it will be, well, stiffer and potentially slower rolling as well. With a top-tier cross-country tyre, you're going to have a really supple, lightweight carcass. You might need to run higher pressures because the sidewalls won't have the support, but because of these wonderfully supple sidewalls, it'll have less hysteresis. That's the energy losses as the tyre rolls through its own carcass. Trail tyres will have a similar construction to XC, but with some reinforcement in the sidewalls and maybe under the tread. And that's so that they can roll smoothly and offer you just enough protection. Whereas EMTB, Enduro and DH casings have, well, really burly reinforcement under the tread and in the sidewalls. And they offer the most support, which means you can run slightly lower pressure. Now, tubeless versus tube, you're going to have a slightly different carcass construction. And that's because with tubeless, you'll have an extra layer of rubber on the inside. And that's to help with sort of air retention over time. And it can make for a slightly more robust tyre. Now, the other factor with all these things is, well, actually tread. Whilst the tread pattern and the way the lugs are added to the tyre shouldn't affect what pressure you run, they can affect the stiffness a little bit. So if you've got really big chunks, they can stiffen up the carcass, versus if you've got lots of small little bits of rubber, it means the carcass can probably stay a little bit more supple. Depending on if you're running tubes or you've got a tubeless setup, is going to impact how low a pressure you can run. Why? Well, The air in our tyre is a little bit like a suspension system, and much like a suspension system, we want to bottom it out once on a ride, or maybe twice. But with tubes, that can be problematic because, well, we can pinch flat. Sometimes these are called snake bites because, well, they look a little bit like a snake bite, or the tube does afterwards. What's happening is that the tyre is getting caught between, well, an immovable object on the trail and the rim. And the shear force of those two meeting means that, well, the tube gets cut. You could run higher pressures, you could run a thicker tube, or you could switch to a burlier TPU tube. So these are a thermoplastic, and they can be very light, but they can also be made more reinforced and a little bit stronger. But when you're playing with pressure and you're playing with tubes, the risk of pinch flats is always going to be a problem. And it's a problem that can probably only be cured by more air. Running a tubeless setup means, as the name suggests, there isn't a tube to pinch. So if you do pinch flat, because yes, you can pinch flat a tyre with a tubeless setup, often the sealant can help, and if not, you can use a plug. But the pressures that you can use and you can run with a tubeless setup are so much lower than with a tube before this happens. And if you're using the right tyre, as we've discussed, that can help too. If you're still crashing into these sort of pinching tyre issues, there is extra insurance that you can use, and that's a tyre insert. They are really lightweight, they are now very easy to fit, and it creates a barrier between your rim and, well, the ground. So it means that you're less likely to pinch flat and you can protect your rim. As we're building up to the perfect pressure, now it's just time to ask for a little favour. And that's, if you like this video, if you could click the thumbs up, it really helps us keep creating good content like this. And if you haven't already, if you could subscribe to the channel, that also helps. Thank you. Where we ride is another core factor in setting tyre pressure. Unlike the roadies that have got smooth tarmac or rough cobbles, we've got a whole spectrum of different terrain, and we need to set pressures to match that. So if you're riding especially rooty terrain, you might have to air up a little bit. If you're riding especially rocky terrain, you're going to have to put more pressure in. If you're riding steeper terrain, again, you're going to have to put more air in. Why? Well, the loads and forces that you're pulling through the bike are going to be higher. You're going to be hitting these square edges, whether they be roots or rocks. And on steeper terrain, there's more loads because you're pushing more into the bike. So yes, you need to run as low a pressure as possible to get the most grip, but you need to be careful not to get these pinch flats or rim packs. What bike you have and what suspension travel that bike has are the next pieces of the puzzle for setting pressure. Why? Well, different bikes are built now to different categories and different standardizations. So the level and height of drop-offs that they can do safely, repeatedly, is going to be different for different bikes. So example, an XC bike, it's going to be relatively low height. And that means that you'd be able to get away with actually lower pressures because those peak loads that are going through the bike are going to be less. Conversely, if you've got a long travel enduro bike, well, you're going to be hitting much bigger drops and hitting terrain, technical terrain, much faster pace. And that means those peak loads that are going through the tyres and through the wheels are going to be higher, which means, yep, you're going to have to run higher pressures. Of course, it does depend on what tyres you're running. So if you're running a lightweight trail carcass on your enduro bike, well, you're going to have to give that tyre even more support and run an even higher pressure, especially on the rear, because there's so much load going through the back. System weight will mean that you're going to have different pressures for different overall system weights. So what do I mean? Well, setting tyre pressure is much like setting suspension sag. So with that, if there's more load, heavier bike, heavier rider, more kit, well, you're going to have to put more pressure in to support the whole system. And that's the same with tyre pressure. It's a similar system. So if you're on the burlier side or you're carrying extra stuff, then you're going to need to up those pressures. The theme of suspension runs through to setting pressures when we talk about rider style as well. So if you're a smooth and mellow rider that takes really clean lines, well, you probably be able to get away with a lower pressure because you're just being gentler on the bike. Conversely, if you're a really aggressive rider where you're railing into turns and really pushing the bike through roots and rocks and through tough sections, you're going to need to up pressures, much like you would if you're setting your sag and setting your suspension up. All of this low pressure chat is in the quest to get more grip, because when we have more grip, we have more control. especially from our tyres. And the lower pressure helps because it allows the tyre to conform to the terrain. So as you're rolling over all the different textures, it allows all these tread lugs, all these details, all these working edges of the tyre, the sipes, the knobs, all of it to interlock with the ground and give you more traction because you've got more surface area. So yes, those lugs matter. They're really deep, big, aggressive tread lugs, if the ground is soft, can generate lots of grip, but you might be surprised. Actually, the lower knob heights can work really well when conditions are hard. But what tyres work for you is going to depend on lots of things, of how you ride and where you ride and what the general theme is, because obviously everyone's ride has got a little bit of something different. Rolling resistance is linked to tyre pressure. The old rhetoric was that you pumped up your tyres as hard as possible and that would give you the most efficient riding experience. And that's just wrong. Even roadies who are running on 28 to 30mm wide tyres, really tiny tyres, have realised that actually they need to run lower pressures. And that's because there's this hysteresis and impedance loss stuff that's happening. And it is relatively complex. But essentially, if you're rolling along, these losses from the tyre carcass and rolling up and over obstacles do slow you down, and that creates the rolling resistance. So if you've got a tyre that can actually conform to these shapes and roll over them versus pinging up and over, it can be smoother. And that means, kind of confusingly, that actually lower pressure can roll faster. Of course, if you're getting to a low pressure that you're hitting stuff and bottoming out, that's not going to be efficient. But you can go much, much lower than you think because your tyres and how they work are much, much more efficient than your suspension. So the way they can conform and deal with small bumps is just amazingly efficient. So that means that you should maximise those low pressures to get more grip when you can. Now we've got all the pieces of the puzzle. We know what tyre width and what carcass we're running. We know where we're riding. Is it super rocky? Is it really smooth and mellow? We know what bike we're running. We know how much travel we've got to play with, and we should know what sort of style rider we are. So hopefully now we've got all the knowledge to piece together the perfect pressure. There's a number of different online tyre pressure calculators that you can use, and they're really fun to play with. And it shows that all the different factors that we've talked about do change what pressure you'll need to run. And a good example would be me. I've got a rider weight of around 72 kgs. I'm a mellower rider, not too rad, I'm not too gnarly. And if I was going for an XC ride on a bike not dissimilar to this, we've got 2.4 tyres. I could get away with as low as 19 psi in the front and around 20 or 21 psi in the back. As soon as I change what trail I'm riding, so I'm going to ride a more engaging trail, I need to change those pressure numbers up to 22 on the front and up to 25 on the back. And it shows that you're just changing one of the variables in this whole puzzle means that it changes the end result. So what I will say is that you want to try and get the lowest pressure that you can get away with. And I say get away with, we don't want pinch flats, we don't want damaged rims either. But there's a way to mitigate that. So if you feel your tyre bottoming out on the rim, go up by at least 1 psi. If you're riding along and you're getting a kind of a bob that's kind of induced by the tyre bouncing around, again, go up 1 psi. But don't be afraid to go low because you can get much more grip and with that, much more control. Well over a century since their inception, pneumatic tyres are still amazing. Setting pressures for your tyres is one of the best performance upgrades that you can make. You get more traction, you get more control, and you get more comfort almost for free. So let me know in the comments below what tyres you're running for your local patch, and key, what pressure is your favourite? How do you optimise them? Let me know.